He was never meant to make it out of that valley alive, but the silence that followed was worse than death itself. The wind moved first, slow and cold, dragging the scent of pine and damp earth across a stretch of wilderness untouched by roads or reason. Somewhere deep in northern Montana, where the trees stood tall like witnesses and the sky felt too wide for a man to hide in. Staff Sergeant Caleb Rourke lay half-curled against the base of a fallen log, his breath shallow, uneven, the kind that came not from rest but from holding on. His uniform was torn at the sleeve, dust clinging to the fabric, a faint tremor running through his hands as he pressed one palm into the soil as if trying to anchor himself to something real. Around him, the forest held its breath. No birds, no distant engines, just the low whisper of wind brushing through branches and the quiet, ticking rhythm of something unseen moving through the underbrush. Caleb had been trained for war, for chaos, for noise. But this kind of silence, this was different. This was the kind that made a man question if he was already gone. A few yards away, standing still as carved stone, was a German shepherd with a sable coat darkened by shadows and time. The dog's ribs showed faintly beneath his fur, his posture rigid but not from fear. From purpose. His name was Ash, not by birth, but by choice. Because when Caleb found him 3 months ago, buried under the remains of a burned-out shed on the edge of a forgotten town, the only thing left alive in that place had been 2 amber eyes staring through smoke and ruin. Ash hadn't trusted him then. Not at first. But something passed between them that day. Something wordless. Something that didn't need explaining. And now, in this quiet stretch of wilderness, that same dog stood between Caleb and something neither of them could fully see. The air shifted. Subtle. Wrong. Caleb felt it before he heard it. A change in pressure. A tightening of space. His eyes lifted slowly, scanning the tree line, every instinct sharpened, every nerve awake despite the weakness in his body. Easy, he whispered, though his voice barely carried. Ash didn't move, didn't blink. His ears, angled forward, muscles taut beneath his coat, gaze fixed on a point just beyond the reach of light filtering through the branches. Whatever was out there, it wasn't passing through. It was waiting, the kind of waiting that carried intention. Time stretched thin, seconds folding into something heavier. Caleb tried to push himself up, his arm trembling under the effort, but his strength faltered halfway, forcing him back against the log with a sharp breath drawn through clenched teeth. He wasn't ready. Not for this. Not here. And yet, Ash took one slow step forward. Then another. Not retreating. Not hesitating. Advancing. The wind stilled completely now, like the world itself had stepped back to watch. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, not loud, but precise. Deliberate. Ash's head lowered slightly, a low, almost inaudible rumble building in his chest. Not a threat, not a warning, but a decision forming. Caleb felt it then. Not fear. Not exactly. Something deeper. The realization that whatever was about to happen, he would not be the one choosing how it ended. Don't. Caleb breathed, barely more than air, his fingers tightening against the dirt as if that alone could stop what was already unfolding. But Ash didn't look back. Not once. Because some bonds aren't built on commands. They're built on something quieter. Something older. The kind that doesn't ask permission to protect. The forest seemed to lean in as Ash stepped beyond Caleb's line of sight, disappearing between the trees where shadows swallowed shape and sound alike. And in that moment, the silence broke, not with noise, but with absence. The absence of certainty. The absence of control. The absence of knowing whether the next breath Caleb took would be his own or borrowed. He closed his eyes for just a second, just enough to remember the way Ash had looked at him the first night he brought him home, guarded, broken, but still choosing to stay. And now, the roles had shifted. The man who once saved the dog was no longer the one in control of the ending. The forest held its breath again, and somewhere beyond the trees, something moved. Before we begin, tell me where are witching from drop your country in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story travels. The forest did not return to normal after Ash disappeared into it. It shifted into something older, something watchful, as if every tree had turned its attention toward the same unseen point beyond Caleb Rourke's reach. And for a long second that stretched like a held breath, nothing happened, no sound, no movement. Just the weight of waiting pressing down on his chest, heavier than the pain in his ribs, heavier than the exhaustion that had been stalking him since dawn. And then it came, not a roar, not anything loud or dramatic, but a disturbance in rhythm, a break in the pattern of wind and leaves that did not belong, subtle enough that only someone trained to listen beyond noise would feel it. And Caleb felt it, deep in his bones, the same way he had felt danger overseas before it ever showed itself. And his eyes snapped open, scanning the space where Ash had vanished. But the trees gave nothing back, only shadows layered over shadows. And for the first time since the ambush that had left him stranded out here, Caleb understood something he had not allowed himself to think. He was not the one holding the line anymore. Somewhere out there, the dog he had pulled from ashes was now standing in a place meant for soldiers, and Caleb tried to push himself up again, forcing his body to respond. His arms shaking violently as he dug his fingers into the soil, pulling, dragging himself forward inch by inch, until his shoulder brushed against the rough bark of the fallen log. The scent of damp wood filling his lungs, grounding him, reminding him he was still here, still breathing, even if barely. And then he heard it, not from far away, but closer now, a shift of weight, a presence circling rather than charging, patient, calculated, the kind of presence that did not rush because it did not need to. And Caleb's jaw tightened as his training kicked in, cataloging details he could not fully see, mapping the space in his mind, counting the seconds between each faint sound. But every instinct he had was incomplete without one thing: Ash, because the dog was not just his partner, he was the second set of senses that made the world make sense. And without him in sight, the silence became louder, more dangerous, more uncertain. And then out of that silence came a single sound, soft but unmistakable, a low exhale that did not belong to the wind, followed by the faint crunch of leaves under controlled movement, not random, not wandering, but deliberate. And Caleb's breath caught in his throat as his eyes locked onto the narrow gap between two trees where the light bent just slightly differently. And for a split second he thought he saw motion, not clearly, just enough to know something was there, something that had been there longer than he realized. And then from somewhere deeper in the trees came another sound, one Caleb knew instantly, not because of its volume, but because of its meaning, a single, restrained bark, not loud, not panicked, but firm, a signal, Ash's signal, the one he used when something had been found but not yet engaged, the one that meant stay, wait, trust me. And Caleb's chest tightened, not from fear, but from the weight of what that meant, because Ash was not retreating, he was holding position, holding ground that Caleb himself could not reach. And for a moment the Marine closed his eyes, just briefly, letting that realization settle into something deeper than thought, into something that felt dangerously close to faith. Because there are moments in a man's life when control slips out of his hands, when all the training, all the strength, all the certainty falls away, and all that remains is the quiet decision to trust something beyond himself. And when Caleb opened his eyes again, the forest had changed once more, not calmer, not safer, but clearer in a way that did not come from sight. Because now he understood his role had shifted. He was no longer the shield. He was the one being protected. And somewhere ahead, just beyond the edge of what he could see, Ash was making a choice, not out of instinct alone, but out of something that had been built in the space between them, something earned, something given, something that did not ask for permission. And the wind returned then, slow and steady, carrying with it a faint trace of scent, earth, pine, and something sharper beneath it, something that made Caleb's instincts sharpen again. And as he listened, really listened, he realized the movement had stopped, completely. No circling, no shifting, just stillness again. But this time it was not empty. It was full of tension, full of decision. And then, cutting through it all, came a second sound from Ash, lower, longer, not a warning, not a call, but something final, something that told Caleb without words that whatever stood between them had just changed. And Caleb's hand tightened into the dirt as he whispered, barely audible, "I trust you." Not knowing if the dog could hear him, not knowing if it would matter, but knowing that in this moment, it was the only truth he had left. And somewhere in the trees, unseen but undeniable, something answered, not with sound, but with the sudden, unmistakable shift of fate moving forward. The silence did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a thread being pulled from something tightly woven, and Caleb felt it before he saw it, the tension loosening just enough to let breath return to his lungs, though not fully, not safely. Just enough to remind him he was still part of this moment, still tethered to whatever was unfolding beyond the trees. And then there it was again, movement, but different now, not circling, not pressing inward, but shifting away, cautious, measured, as if whatever had been watching had reconsidered something it did not expect, and Caleb's eyes narrowed, trying to catch even a fragment of shape through the branches. But the forest did not reveal its secrets so easily. It never had. And then, through that layered quiet, came the sound that changed everything, soft at first, almost lost in the wind, the steady rhythm of paws against the forest floor, not running, not fleeing, but returning, and Caleb's chest tightened as his gaze locked forward, waiting, counting each second until Ash reappeared between the trees, his silhouette forming slowly out of shadow, tall ears forward, body low but controlled, his coat catching the faint light in streaks of sable and black. And for a moment, just a moment, Caleb could not move, because what he saw in that dog's posture was not fear, not relief, but something heavier, something that carried the weight of a decision already made. And Ash stopped a few yards away, his amber eyes fixed on Caleb with an intensity that felt almost human, almost knowing. And there was dirt along his flank, leaves caught in his fur, signs of movement through terrain that had not been gentle. But none of that mattered, because what Caleb saw in those eyes was a message, clear and undeniable: it is not over. And before he could speak, before he could even fully process the shift in the air, Ash turned his head slightly, just enough to look back toward the trees he had come from, not in fear, but in acknowledgement, and Caleb followed that glance instinctively, his body tensing despite its weakness, expecting something to emerge, something to follow. But nothing came, only the forest standing still again, as if whatever had been there had chosen to remain unseen, or perhaps had chosen to leave entirely. And that uncertainty settled into Caleb's chest like a weight that would not lift, because he knew enough to understand that not every battle ended with a clear line between victory and retreat. Sometimes it ended with space, with distance, with a fragile kind of peace that could shift at any moment. And Ash stepped closer then, slow, deliberate, closing the distance between them until he was within reach. And without hesitation, without command, he lowered himself beside Caleb, pressing his body lightly against the marine's side, not to restrain, not to control, but to anchor, to remind, to hold. And Caleb let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his hand moving almost automatically to rest against the dog's neck, fingers threading through thick fur still warm despite the cold air. And for a moment, the world narrowed to that single point of contact, man and dog, breath and heartbeat, pain and presence. And Caleb closed his eyes briefly, not in surrender, but in recognition, because he understood now something he had not fully allowed himself to see before. Ash had not just stood between him and danger. He had changed the outcome without force, without noise, without anything Caleb had been trained to rely on. And that realization sat deeper than any lesson he had learned in uniform, because it spoke to something quieter, something that did not come from orders or strategy, but from instinct shaped by trust. And when Caleb opened his eyes again, Ash was still watching the tree line, still alert, still ready. But now there was something else in his posture, something steadier, something resolved, and Caleb shifted slightly, forcing himself upright just enough to lean back against the log, the effort sending a sharp reminder through his body that he was far from safe, far from stable, but no longer alone in the way he had been moments before. And the wind moved again through the forest, softer now, carrying the scent of pine and distant water. And for the first time since the silence had fallen, it did not feel like a warning. It felt like a pause, a breath between moments. And Caleb's gaze lingered on the space between the trees, knowing without seeing that whatever had been there had chosen not to return, not yet. And that was enough, for now. And he exhaled slowly, his voice rough but steady as he murmured, "Good boy." Not as a command, not as praise, but as something closer to gratitude, something closer to understanding. and Ash did not react with excitement or movement. He simply remained there, grounded, present, his body a quiet barrier between Caleb and the unknown, and in that stillness, something unspoken passed between them again. Not a promise, not a guarantee, but a shared awareness that whatever came next would not be faced alone. And as the forest settled into its fragile calm, Caleb realized that survival was no longer just about endurance. It was about the bond that had carried them both to this moment, a bond that had just shifted into something neither of them could walk away from, no matter what waited beyond the trees. The calm did not last, not because the forest grew louder, but because Caleb began to hear more within it, the subtle layers beneath the quiet that only revealed themselves when a man stopped fighting the moment and started listening to it. And as he sat there with his back against the fallen log, Ash pressed steady at his side. He realized the world around them had not softened, it had only shifted its rhythm, and somewhere beyond the visible line of trees, something still lingered, not closing in, not retreating fully, but existing in that thin space between presence and absence, and that was enough to keep every instinct in his body awake, sharp, and unwilling to rest. And yet there was something else now, something new that had not been there before, a faint thread of direction forming in his mind, not from sight, but from the way the air moved, from the way Ash's posture adjusted in small, almost imperceptible ways, the dog's ears tilting not just toward threat, but toward distance, toward something beyond it. And Caleb followed that subtle shift, his gaze lifting past the dense cluster of pines to a narrow break in the tree line where the ground sloped gently downward, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. And in that direction, carried faintly on the wind, was a scent that did not belong to decay or damp earth, something cleaner, something lighter, water, moving water, not far, maybe a quarter-mile at most, and Caleb's breath caught slightly as the realization settled in, because water meant a path, and a path meant a chance, not a guarantee, not safety, but movement, and movement was the difference between waiting and surviving, and he shifted again, forcing his body to respond despite the protest in every muscle, his hand gripping the rough bark as he pulled himself upright just enough to sit higher, to see clearer, and Ash adjusted with him instantly, rising to his feet, steady, alert, his body angled slightly toward that same unseen direction, as if he had already mapped the route long before Caleb had noticed it. And for a moment, the Marine allowed himself a small, quiet breath of something close to hope, not the loud kind, not the kind that promises outcomes, but the kind that simply says there is still a way forward. And he reached down, his fingers brushing against the worn metal of the dog tags resting against his chest beneath his jacket, the cool weight grounding him, reminding him of who he had been before this moment, before the silence, before the shift. And then he looked at Ash again, really looked, taking in the steadiness in the dog's stance, the quiet readiness, the absence of hesitation, and something in Caleb's expression changed, not softer, not weaker, but clearer, because he understood now that whatever came next would not be about holding ground. It would be about moving through it, and slowly, carefully, he planted one boot against the soil, pushing himself up inch by inch, the effort dragging a sharp breath from his lungs as his balance wavered. But he did not fall, not this time, because Ash moved closer, just enough to steady him without force, without pressure, simply present, a silent support that asked for nothing and gave everything. And Caleb let out a quiet exhale, nodding once as if confirming a decision to himself. And then, with a voice still rough but carrying a new edge of purpose, he said, "We are not staying here." And Ash's ears flicked, slightly at the sound, not as a command, but as acknowledgement. And together they took the first step, not fast, not clean, but forward, into the narrow path between trees where the light filtered differently, where the ground shifted underfoot, where every sound carried farther than it should, and the forest seemed to watch again, not with the same tension as before, but with something quieter, something that felt almost like recognition, as if it understood that the story unfolding within it had changed direction. And as they moved, Caleb kept his senses wide, every detail registering, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots, the rhythm of Ash's steps beside him, the way the wind carried both warning and guidance at the same time. And though the unseen presence from before did not show itself again, its memory lingered in every shadow, in every pause between breaths, reminding him that distance did not mean absence, and that survival was not a single moment, but a series of choices, made in the dark. And yet with each step, the faint sound of water grew clearer, steady, constant, like a promise that did not need to be spoken, and Caleb tightened his grip on that direction, on that sound, on the quiet strength beside him, because in a place where control had been stripped away, this was enough, more than enough, to keep moving, even as the forest held on to its secrets just a little longer. The path did not open into safety the way Caleb had hoped. It narrowed instead, tightening between dense pines and uneven ground that forced every step to be chosen, not taken, and the sound of water grew louder, but not closer in the way he expected, as if the forest itself was bending distance, stretching space just enough to test how far he could go before something inside him gave out, and his breath came heavier now, each inhale dragging through his chest like it had weight, like it had something to prove. And still he moved, one step, then another, boots scraping against roots hidden beneath the soil, shoulders brushing against branches that seemed to reach inward rather than grow outward, and beside him Ash stayed in rhythm, not ahead, not behind, but exactly where he needed to be, a quiet alignment that felt less like training and more like instinct shaped by something deeper, something neither of them had words for. And then it happened again, not the same as before, but enough to stop Caleb mid-step. The air shifted, not colder, not warmer, but aware, like the forest had turned its attention back to them, and Ash froze instantly, his body going still in a way that spoke louder than any sound. His ears forward, head low, eyes locked on a point Caleb could not yet see, and the Marine's pulse quickened, not from panic, but from recognition, because he had felt this before, that thin edge where movement could become something else entirely, and he followed Ash's gaze slowly, carefully, his vision adjusting to the layered shadows ahead until the shape revealed itself, not fully, not clearly, just enough to exist, a presence standing just beyond the reach of light, unmoving, patient, watching, and Caleb's breath caught, not because he could define it, but because he could not. And in that uncertainty, there was something more dangerous than anything visible, something that did not need to announce itself to be understood, and for a moment neither of them moved. Man and dog held in a stillness that felt suspended between decision and consequence. And then Ash stepped forward, not fast, not aggressive, but intentional, placing himself slightly ahead of Caleb, his body forming that same quiet barrier as before, but this time closer, this time without distance, and Caleb felt something inside him tighten, not in fear, but in resistance, because this was not how it was supposed to go. He was the one who stood in front, he was the one who held the line, and yet here he was again, watching that role shift out of his hands and into something that did not hesitate the way he now had to. And his voice came out low, strained but steady. Ash, stay. Not as an order, but as a plea, something softer than command, something that carried more weight than authority, and for a fraction of a second, the dog's ear flicked back, acknowledging the sound, the connection, the bond, but his stance did not change, because some decisions do not come from obedience. They come from knowing, and Caleb saw it then, clear as anything he had ever understood. Ash had already chosen, not in this moment, not in response to what stood ahead, but long before, back when he stepped out of the ashes and into Caleb's life, back when trust was not given but built, piece by piece. And now that trust had become something else, something stronger, something that did not wait for permission, and the presence ahead shifted slightly, not advancing, not retreating, but acknowledging the line that had been drawn, not by force, but by something quieter, something harder to break. And the forest seemed to hold its breath again, every branch, every leaf, every inch of ground suspended in that fragile balance. And Caleb's hand tightened at his side, his body leaning forward despite the weakness that threatened to pull him back, because every instinct in him was screaming to step in, to take that place, to reclaim the role that had defined him for so long. But his legs did not move, not because they could not, but because something deeper held him still, something that understood what this moment required. And Ash stood firm, unshaken, his presence not loud, not forceful, but absolute, and time stretched again, bending around the space between them and whatever stood beyond, until slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension shifted, the air loosening just enough to signal change, and the shape in the shadows receded, not in defeat, not in fear, but in choice, leaving behind nothing but the echo of what could have been. And when it was gone, truly gone, the forest exhaled, the wind returning in a soft, steady flow that carried away the weight of that moment. And Ash remained where he stood for a second longer, just long enough to confirm what his instincts had already told him. And then he turned, walking back to Caleb with that same quiet certainty, pressing close again, grounding, anchoring, and Caleb let out a breath that felt like it had been held for miles, his hand finding Ash's neck as his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "You do not leave me, do you?" And the dog did not answer with sound, but with presence, with the steady weight of his body against Caleb's side. And in that silence, in that simple act of staying, something inside Caleb shifted, something deeper than pride, deeper than control, something that felt like surrender, but not to fear, to trust. And as he looked ahead again toward the path that still waited, the sound of water now clearer than ever, he realized this was no longer just about getting out. It was about understanding what had already been given to him, something that could not be trained, could not be commanded, something that had chosen him in return. And that realization settled into his chest with a quiet, undeniable weight as they prepared to take the next step forward. The next step felt different, not because the forest had changed, but because Caleb had. And as he moved forward again with Ash steady at his side, the weight in his chest no longer came from fear alone. It came from understanding, from the quiet realization that survival was no longer something he carried by himself. And the sound of water, once distant and uncertain, now threaded clearly through the trees ahead, a constant, guiding presence that pulled them forward one careful step at a time. And yet the path did not grow easier. If anything, it demanded more, the ground sloping unevenly, loose stones shifting beneath his boots, branches catching at his sleeves as if testing his resolve. And Caleb stumbled once, his leg faltering under him, a sharp breath escaping as his balance broke. But before he could fall, Ash pressed into him, firm, unwavering, enough to steady him without force, and Caleb caught himself, his hand gripping the trunk of a nearby tree, the rough bark biting into his palm, grounding him, reminding him he was still here, still moving. And he let out a slow breath, nodding faintly, more to himself than to the dog, because every step now felt like a choice that mattered more than the last. And the forest seemed to watch them still, not with the same tension as before, but with a quiet awareness, as if it recognized the shift that had taken place between man and dog, as if it understood that something had been exchanged out here that could not be undone. And as they moved deeper, the light began to change, filtering through the trees in softer tones, the dense shadows thinning just enough to reveal more of the ground ahead. And then, through the trees, Caleb saw it, not all at once, but in fragments, a glint of movement, a shimmer between trunks, until finally the forest opened just enough to reveal a narrow stream cutting through the earth, water moving steady and clear over smooth stones, the sound filling the space with something that felt almost like relief. And Caleb stopped for a moment, his chest rising and falling as he took it in, because water meant more than direction. It meant life. It meant a line he could follow, a chance to move out of this maze of trees and into something wider, something that might lead him back. And Ash stepped forward slightly, lowering his head to the edge of the stream, not drinking yet, just observing, his ears still alert, his body still tuned to the world around them. And Caleb followed slowly, lowering himself carefully to one knee beside the water, the movement costing him more than he wanted to admit. But he did not rush it, because out here, rushing was what got a man lost. And he cupped his hand into the stream, lifting the cold water to his lips, the chill cutting through the dryness in his throat, grounding him in a way nothing else had since this began. And for a moment, just a moment, the world felt quieter, not empty, not safe, but balanced. And he exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting along the line of the stream as it curved through the forest, disappearing beyond sight, a path waiting to be followed. And then he noticed something else, something small, almost easy to miss, but enough to tighten his focus again. Tracks, faint impressions in the damp soil near the water's edge, not fresh, but not old either, layered, overlapping, some small, some larger, all leading along the same direction the stream carried. And Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied them, because this was no longer just wilderness. This was a place that had been used, moved through, claimed in ways that were not random, and Ash noticed it too. His posture shifting subtly, his nose lowering closer to the ground as he traced the edges of those marks, his body still calm, but more alert, more aware, and Caleb felt that shift immediately, the quiet calm of finding water giving way to something more complex, something that carried both opportunity and risk, and he straightened slightly, his hand resting briefly against Ash's shoulder, grounding himself in that presence before looking ahead again, because whatever path this stream offered, it was not empty, it belonged to something, something that moved through it with purpose. And as the water continued its steady flow, reflecting the filtered light above, Caleb realized that this next part would not be about reaching safety. It would be about moving through a space that held its own rules, its own balance, and the only way forward was to understand that, to respect it, and to keep moving anyway. And he took a slow breath, his voice low but steady as he said, "We follow the water," not as a command, but as a decision shared, and Ash lifted his head slightly, eyes forward, ready, and together they stepped along the edge of the stream, not knowing where it would lead, only knowing that standing still was no longer an option, and somewhere, beneath the sound of water and wind, the forest seemed to listen once more. The stream did not lead them out the way Caleb had imagined. It drew them deeper first, bending through the forest in long, quiet curves that seemed to test patience more than endurance. And as they followed its edge, the ground softened underfoot, damp soil giving way to patches of moss that muffled their steps, turning every movement into something quieter, something almost hidden, and the air grew cooler here, carrying the clean scent of running water mixed with something older, something that lingered beneath the surface like a memory the land refused to let go of, and Caleb felt it as a weight just behind his awareness, not enough to stop him, but enough to remind him that this place was not empty, that every inch of it had been shaped by something long before he arrived. And Ash moved differently now, not tense, not rigid, but focused in a way that spoke of layered awareness, his nose dipping toward the ground, then lifting toward the air, reading what could not be seen, and Caleb trusted that rhythm without question, because by now he understood that survival here did not come from forcing direction. It came from listening, from allowing the world to reveal itself piece by piece. And then the stream narrowed suddenly, pulling tighter between two banks of stone that rose just high enough to funnel the water into a faster current, the sound sharpening, echoing faintly against the rock, and Caleb slowed, his eyes scanning the space ahead, because this was the kind of place where paths changed without warning, where what looked simple from a distance could close in without escape. And Ash stopped at the edge of the narrow pass, his body still, ears angled forward, not in alarm, but in consideration, and for a moment neither of them moved, the water rushing between them and whatever lay beyond, until Ash stepped forward carefully, placing his paw on the stone, testing the surface before shifting his weight. Then another step, steady, deliberate, crossing to the other side without hesitation, and Caleb watched him, studying the path, calculating the distance, the angle, the stability of the rock beneath the flow. And then he followed, slower, more cautious, his boot finding purchase where Ash had stepped, his body leaning slightly into the movement to keep balance as the current pressed against the edges of his footing. And when he reached the other side, he paused, catching his breath, the effort heavier than it should have been, but he did not let that slow him, because something had changed again, not in the environment, but in the air itself, and Ash felt it first, his head lifting sharply, ears forward, body angled not toward the path ahead, but slightly off to the right, toward a cluster of trees where the underbrush thickened, and Caleb followed that shift, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the space between trunks where the light did not quite reach. And then he saw it, not movement, not fully, but a shape that did not belong to the stillness, a presence watching from the edge of visibility. And his breath slowed, not in fear, but in recognition. Because this was not the same tension as before, This was closer, more defined, more aware of them as they were of it. And Ash stepped forward again, not placing himself directly between Caleb and the presence this time, but slightly to the side, creating space rather than blocking it. His posture calm but grounded, and Caleb felt that difference immediately, understanding that this moment was not about holding a line. It was about passing through one, and he took a slow step forward, his body steady despite the strain, his gaze fixed ahead but his awareness wide, taking in every detail, every sound, every shift in the air, and the presence did not move toward them, did not retreat. It simply remained, watching, as if measuring something unseen, something deeper than distance. And for a moment time stretched again, not in tension, but in decision, until Ash let out a soft exhale, barely audible, a sound that carried no threat, no challenge, just acknowledgement, and Caleb felt something inside him settle in response. Not completely, not fully, but enough to take the next step, and then another, moving past the edge of that unseen boundary without breaking it, without forcing it, and as they crossed that invisible line, the presence did not follow, did not press. It remained where it was, fading back into the forest as if it had only been there to witness, not to act. And when Caleb finally allowed himself to look back, just once, there was nothing there but trees and shadow and the quiet movement of leaves in the wind. And he turned forward again, the path widening slightly ahead as the stream curved away, opening into a stretch of forest that felt different, not safer, but less confined. And Ash moved beside him once more, steady, present, his role shifting again from barrier to guide. And Caleb exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost beneath the water and wind, because he understood now that this journey was not about escaping what followed them. It was about moving through what stood in their way without becoming part of it. And that required something he had only just begun to learn, not strength, not control, but trust carried far enough to become instinct. And as they continued forward along the stream, the forest no longer felt like something to survive. It felt like something to understand, even as it held on to its silence just a little longer. The forest began to breathe differently as they moved forward, not quieter, not louder, but wider, as if the space between each tree had stretched just enough to let something new pass through. And Caleb felt it in the way his shoulders eased without permission, in the way each step no longer felt like it was being measured by something unseen, and the stream beside them widened as well, its current slowing, its surface smoothing into long reflective stretches that caught the fading light, and held it like a memory that refused to disappear. And for the first time since the silence had closed in around him, Caleb realized he could see farther, not just with his eyes, but with something steadier inside him, something that had been rebuilt piece by piece through every step, every pause. Every moment he chose to trust what stood beside him instead of what stood against him. And Ash moved with a different rhythm now, no longer testing each step with caution, but guiding with quiet certainty. His body relaxed yet alert, his ears still tuned to the world but no longer fixed on a single threat. And Caleb followed without hesitation, because by now he understood that direction did not always come from maps or memory. Sometimes it came from presence, from the way something moved through the world without doubt. And then the trees began to thin, gradually at first, then more noticeably. The dense wall of forest giving way to patches of open ground where grass pushed through the soil and light settled more fully, and Caleb's breath caught, not from effort, but from recognition, because this was not just a change in terrain, it was a shift in possibility. And he slowed slightly, his eyes scanning ahead, taking in every detail with a clarity that had been missing before. And there it was, just beyond the next line of trees, a break, not wide, not dramatic, but enough. A narrow clearing where the stream curved outward and the forest stepped back just enough to reveal a slope leading downward. And beyond that, barely visible through the distance, something man-made, a line too straight to be natural, a structure partially hidden by distance and light, but unmistakable to someone who had spent enough time reading terrain. And Caleb's chest tightened as hope rose again, stronger this time, more defined, not just a possibility, but a direction. And he took a step forward, then another, his pace shifting from cautious to purposeful, not reckless, but no longer held back by uncertainty. and Ash matched him easily, moving ahead just enough to lead without leaving. His presence still anchored to Caleb even as the path opened before them, and the air carried new scents now, faint but undeniable, something dry, something touched by human presence, wood, maybe metal, distant but real, and Caleb felt it settle into his senses like a signal he had been waiting for without knowing it. And yet, even as the clearing drew closer, even as the forest seemed to release its hold on them, there was one last pause, not forced, not imposed, but chosen, and Caleb stopped at the edge of the trees, his gaze drifting back over his shoulder toward the path they had come through, the dense shadows. Now standing quiet and still, offering no trace of what had watched them, no sign of what had stepped back instead of forward, and for a moment, just a moment, he stood there, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement, because he understood now that what they had passed through had not been conquered, it had been respected, and that difference mattered more than anything else, and Ash stood beside him, not looking back, but forward, his focus steady, his purpose unchanged, and Caleb nodded faintly, not to the forest, not to himself, but to the silent understanding that had carried them both this far. And then he turned, stepping out of the trees and into the clearing, the light falling fully across his shoulders for the first time, the sound of the stream opening into a wider flow beside him, and the distant structure becoming clearer with each step, not yet close, not yet certain, but real enough to move toward. And as they walked, side by side, the forest behind them did not follow, did not close in. It remained where it was, holding its silence, holding its secrets, and Caleb did not look back again, because some places are not meant to be understood completely, only passed through. And as the ground leveled beneath his boots and the path ahead opened wider, he realized that whatever had been given to him back there had not stayed behind. It had come with him, carried not in memory, but in the quiet, unwavering presence at his side, and that was enough to keep moving forward into whatever waited beyond the edge of the trees. The clearing did not greet them with noise or urgency. It welcomed them with stillness, the kind that comes after something has already been decided, and Caleb stepped into it slowly, each movement deliberate, as if he understood that crossing this line was not just about distance, but about transition, from survival into something quieter, something harder to name, and the structure ahead came into clearer view now. An old ranger outpost tucked against the slope, weathered with faded by years of sun and snow, its windows dark but intact, its presence steady in a way that spoke of shelter rather than abandonment, and Caleb's breath deepened as he took it in, not rushing, not breaking into relief, because relief had changed its meaning somewhere back in the trees, and Ash moved ahead a few steps, scanning the area with calm precision, his posture relaxed but attentive, reading the space not for threat, but for truth, and when he found none, he slowed, turning his head slightly toward Caleb in that quiet, familiar way that asked nothing but shared everything. And Caleb followed, closing the distance between them and the small structure, his boots pressing into softer ground now, grass bending underfoot instead of snapping, the air warmer, touched by open sky, and when he reached the porch, he paused, his hand resting briefly against the wooden rail, the texture rough but solid, real in a way that grounded him more than anything else had since this began, and he let out a breath, long and steady, not because it was over, but because something inside him had finally caught up with where he stood, and Ash stepped beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, his gaze drifting not toward the door, but back toward the forest line, not in concern, but in acknowledgement, and Caleb followed that glance once more, his eyes tracing the edge of the trees where shadow met light, and for a moment, just a moment, he thought he saw it again, not clearly, not fully, just a presence standing where the forest held its breath, watching, not with hunger, not with threat, but with something quieter, something that felt almost like acceptance, and Caleb did not tense, did not step back. He simply held that gaze for a second longer than before, then nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion that carried more meaning than words ever could, because he understood now that not every encounter needed an ending. Some were meant to remain unfinished, held in that space between what was and what could have been. And when he turned back toward the outpost, the door waiting, the promise of shelter just within reach. He did so without looking back again, not out of fear, but out of trust. Trust that what had followed them had chosen to stay behind. Trust that what had been given to him would not be taken away. And he reached for the handle, pushing the door open slowly, the hinges giving a low, tired creak as the interior revealed itself. Simple, empty, but dry, safe enough for now. And he stepped inside, Ash following without hesitation, the two of them crossing that threshold together. And for a moment, the world outside softened, the sound of the stream fading slightly, the wind less sharp, the weight of the forest settling into something distant, something remembered rather than immediate. And Caleb stood there in the quiet, his hand resting against the worn edge of a table, his breath steady, his body still, and Ash moved to his side once more, lowering himself to the floor with a slow, controlled motion, his eyes still alert but no longer searching. And Caleb looked down at him, really looked, seeing not just the dog he had rescued, but the one who had carried him through something he could not have faced alone. And his voice came out low, almost reverent. "You saved me." Not as a statement of fact, but as something deeper, something closer to truth. And Ash did not respond with sound. He simply remained, present, steady, his breathing even, his gaze calm. And in that silence, Caleb understood something that would stay with him long after this moment. That survival is not always about who stands the strongest. Sometimes it is about who stays, who chooses not to leave when leaving would be easier. And as the light outside began to soften into the early edge of evening, casting long shadows across the clearing, Caleb stepped toward the window, his eyes drifting once more to the line of trees in the distance. And though he saw nothing there now, no movement, no presence, he felt no need to search for it, because whatever had been watching had already played its part, and what remained was not fear, not uncertainty, but something quieter, something that settled into his chest like a final, unspoken understanding. And as he stood there with Ash at his side, the world no longer felt like something to survive. It felt like something to walk through, one step at a time, with something that could not be seen, but could always be felt. And in that quiet, the story did not end. It simply became something else, something carried forward in the space between a man and the dog who refused to leave him behind. In the heart of a silent Montana wilderness, a wounded U.S. Marine struggles to survive as the forest closes in around him, where every breath feels uncertain and every shadow carries unseen meaning. Beside him stands a loyal German shepherd, not just a rescued dog, but a quiet guardian who refuses to leave, forming a bond that transcends training and enters something deeper, something unspoken. This cinematic journey unfolds as one of the most powerful animal stories, where survival is not defined by strength alone but by trust, instinct, and the silent decisions made between man and animal. As the Marine and his dog move through dense forest, across cold streams, and into unknown territory, they encounter a mysterious presence that tests not only their endurance, but their understanding of fear and faith, turning this into one of those unforgettable animal stories that blend realism with emotional depth. Guided by instinct and loyalty, the German Shepherd becomes more than a companion, stepping into a role that redefines protection and sacrifice without a single command, showing why the most impactful animal stories are often told without words. The journey continues as they follow the sound of water toward hope, navigating terrain shaped by nature and unseen forces, where every step forward is earned and every pause carries meaning, capturing the essence of animal stories that explore resilience and connection. As they finally reach a clearing and discover a remote shelter, the story transforms into something quieter but more powerful, a reflection on survival, trust, and the kind of loyalty that cannot be taught, only chosen, solidifying its place among the most moving animal stories. This is not just a tale of escape, but a deeply human experience told through the eyes of a Marine and the unwavering presence of his German Shepherd. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, the strongest bond may come from the one who simply refuses to walk away, making this one of those rare animal stories that stays with you long after the final scene fades. Character 1, 35-year-old Caucasian U.S. Marine, rugged face, short military haircut, light hazel eyes, athletic build, wearing worn combat uniform and field jacket, front-facing portrait, cinematic lighting, realistic texture, no CGI, no illustration, no cartoon, serious expression character 2. 2-year-old German Shepherd, full body visible, sable black and tan coat, muscular build, upright ears, amber eyes, alert stance, standing on natural ground, front-facing view, highly realistic texture, no CGI, no illustration, no cartoon. 1. A wounded Caucasian U.S. Marine kneels in a quiet forest clearing at soft dawn light. His rugged face focused and compassionate as he gently wraps his worn field jacket around a trembling German Shepherd with a sable black and tan coat. The dog's amber eyes wary yet softening. Both characters close together in a moment of fragile trust. Natural lighting filtering through tall pine trees. Cinematic depth of field, realistic. Textures on skin, fabric, and fur. Emotional expression of care and pain visible. No CGI, no illustration, no cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. 1. 2. A Caucasian U.S. Marine in his mid-30s runs alone along a gravel path at a military base during early morning. His athletic build steady, yet his expression distant and burdened, short military haircut, and light hazel eyes visible. Wearing standard training gear. Background includes barracks and faint silhouettes of other Marines. His posture disciplined but emotionally withdrawn. Cinematic lighting with long shadows. Realistic environment. No CGI, no illustration, no cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. 1. 2. 3. A German Shepherd with a sable coat moves cautiously through a burned rural landscape. Full body visible, ribs slightly showing, ears alert and upright, amber eyes scanning surroundings with guarded intelligence, ash and debris scattered across the ground, soft smoky light in the background. The dog's expression a mix of survival instinct and quiet resilience. Hyper-realistic fur detail, no CGI, no illustration, no cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. 1. 2. 4. In a dense forest under muted daylight, a Caucasian U.S. Marine stands slightly weakened but alert while a German Shepherd steps forward protectively, both facing a shadowy, unseen predator presence between trees, tension thick in the air. The Marine's face focused and strained while the dog's posture is low, controlled, and determined. Cinematic contrast between light and shadow. Atmosphere heavy with suspense. No CGI, no illustration. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. 1. 2. 5. The Marine sits exhausted against a fallen log, breathing heavily, his face marked with fatigue and quiet determination, while the German Shepherd stands a few feet ahead, alert and watchful, ears forward scanning the forest, sunlight breaking faintly through dense trees creating layered shadows. Strong emotional contrast between vulnerability and protection. Realistic textures in environment and characters. No CGI, no illustration, no cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. 1. 2. 6. Moving through dense woodland. The Marine struggles forward with uneven steps, his body slightly hunched from pain, while the German Shepherd stays close at his side guiding subtly. Both framed by tall pine trees and filtered light, expressions focused and determined, environment rich with natural detail, emphasizing partnership and survival, cinematic realism, no CGI, no illustration, no cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. 1. 2. 7. A narrow rocky stream cuts through the forest as the Marine carefully steps across wet stones, guided by the German Shepherd ahead. Water flowing rapidly around them. Both characters focused and synchronized. The Marine's expression tense but trusting while the dog remains steady and confident. Detailed reflections in water, realistic textures, cinematic motion freeze, no CGI, no illustration. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. 1. 2. 8. Near the stream bank, the Marine crouches low studying faint tracks in damp soil. His expression sharp and analytical, while the German Shepherd sniffs the ground nearby with alert posture, ears slightly forward, both aware of something unseen. The forest around them quiet yet tense. detailed environmental textures. Cinematic close composition, no CGI, no illustration, no cartoon.no cartoon.no cartoon. No cartoon. 1, 2, 9 passing through a tight natural corridor between rocks and trees. The German Shepherd leads slightly ahead while the Marine follows cautiously, his body tense but controlled, expressions focused, the environment narrowing around them creating a sense of confinement, soft diffused light above, detailed textures on rock and foliage, cinematic perspective depth, no CGI, no illustration. No cartoon.no cartoon.no cartoon. No cartoon. 1, 2, 10 emerging into a partial clearing. The Marine stands more upright, his expression calmer yet alert, while the German Shepherd walks confidently beside him, both scanning the open space, sunlight brighter and warmer, grass visible underfoot, transition from tension to cautious relief, realistic lighting and shadows, no CGI, no illustration, no cartoon, no cartoon, no cartoon. No cartoon. 1, 2, 11 at the edge of the clearing. Both characters pause and look back toward the darker forest line, the Marine standing tall with quiet acknowledgement in his expression, while the German Shepherd remains calm but attentive, ears slightly raised, the background forest shadowed and mysterious, cinematic framing emphasizing contrast between light and darkness. No CGI, no illustration. No cartoon.no cartoon.no cartoon. No cartoon. 1, 2, 12 inside a weathered ranger outpost at sunset. Warm golden light filters through dusty windows as the Marine stands near a wooden table, his expression softened with quiet gratitude, while the German Shepherd lies beside him calmly, both finally at rest. Environment simple but safe, detailed textures in wood and light, cinematic peaceful resolution, no CGI, no illustration. No cartoon.no cartoon.no cartoon. No cartoon. 1, 2.